What's good, YouTube? It's me, Squid, back in another Squid video. I want to make a video talking about cards that are banned in Yu-Gi-Oh! Currently that can actually come back into the game. We have a lot of banned cards over the years that have been completely forgotten about, and now that the metagame has changed, I think these cards could come back. So guys, let me know what you think. But starting at the top, Fiber Jar. This is a monster that has a flip effect that says each player shuffles all cards from their hand, field, and graveyard into the deck, then draws 5 cards, essentially resetting the entire game save for the differential in life points. And this card was originally banned because it was just a crazy stall type card that could be set and just trigger basically every time, because back in the day there were not a lot of resources to actually remove a face down monster. It was a lot of grindy Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you would actually attack monsters that were set, which is why recruiters back in the day like Mystic Tomato were so good all the way up until about 2011 2012 era. During Edison format, these guys were still played. And Fiber Jar was banned well before that, a couple of years before, and the only card that could really interact with it was the Nobleman of Crossout. Obviously, we did not have the power creep anywhere near that we currently have today, which is why this card has been banned forever, and this card could have came back years ago. Honestly, like if you brought it back like 5-6 years ago, it would have been fine, and I think this is the type of card that eventually Konami is going to realize, hey, this card doesn't do anything, we'll bring it back just to kind of shock the players. A lot like how they did to Cyber Jar a couple of ban lists ago, just bringing this back to 1, and it absolutely did nothing, so I could definitely see the rest of the jars coming back one by one. Next is a tuner type monster that's a little bit controversial, but you guys can tell me if I'm a little bit crazy on this. But FISHBORG Blaster, this is a level 1 fish tuner monster that allows you to bring itself back. It says if you control a face up level 3 or lower water monster, you can discard 1 card, special summon this card from your graveyard, and if this card is used as a synchro material monster, all the synchro material monsters used other than FISHBORG Blaster have to be water. So it was heavily abused in decks that played a lot of fish, for example in Fish OTK, which took advantage of Super Ancient Deep Sea King Coelacanth, who allowed you to discard a card and summon as many level 4 or lower fish type monsters from your deck. So typically you would summon up to 2 copies of FISHBORG Blaster alongside other fish monsters like Oystermeister and continuously synchro into cards that allow you to refill your hand and allow you to discard for the cost of FISHBORG for free in the process, because you're drawing a bunch of cards. And that was of course easily made with multiple copies of Formula Synchron that allow you to draw a card when you synchro summon, or better yet TG Hyper Librarian, which is a card that allows you to draw a card every time a monster is synchro summon, and then neither of these cards are once per turn because they were a lot older, right? So you could essentially draw a bunch of cards while you're synchroing, summon back a bunch of FISHBORG Blasters for free because he's not once per turn, use all your water monsters, and eventually make some Omni Negates like shooting Quasar Dragon, or in today's case, you could probably go a little more stronger with something like a Baron de Fleur. I'm not sure about the power level of this card. We really don't have any strong water type decks in the format, and Konami has already teased that after the Fire King structure decks, the next structure deck is actually going to be an Atlantean structure deck, which could actually bring some semblance of sense if they want to have a tuner fill that void and then become a synchro deck. Then maybe FISHBORG Blaster could actually be something that comes back. There are super rare copies of this available currently, and they are quite high because this card is playable in other formats like the Time Wizard Edison format. But I think this could be a card that could potentially eventually come back and not be too busted in the current metagame. Next is another tuner that's along the same vein. This is an Earth type counterpart to FISHBORG Blaster that's Glow Bulb. It basically allows you to use it twice. You can use it again in the graveyard by sending the top card of your deck to the graveyard and special summon this card. This was very heavily abused in early plant decks that took advantage of cards like Lone Fire Blossom as well as Dandelion to spawn a bunch of tokens, and then you could use Glow Bulb to synchro summon into something like a Librarian, and then you would get 2 tokens off the Dandelion, bring them back, go off into Formula Synchron, allowing you to draw 2 cards, and then continue synchroning off in the process because Formula Synchron happens to be a tuner. Now, this card has also been released in the OCG about over a year ago. Glow Bulb actually came back to the OCG, and it's not done anything in the OCG. In fact, people have neglected completely to play this card, period. They've decided that this card is just not very powerful at all, despite being at 1 in the OCG. And I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think this card can actually come back in the TCG? I don't think it's that powerful. Like, nowadays, you don't really have any ways to take advantage of this. Maybe it could be used in a mill-type deck like TIARLAMENTS, but even still, I don't think that deck has the enough extra deck monsters to actually play synchro monsters to accommodate a lone Glow Bulb, and I feel like the power creep has just crapped this card out completely. So Ultimate Rare Copy Glow Bulb might be a good idea to stock up on, even though it's played in Plant Synchro Tengu format, so that might be already kind of bought out on the market. But I think this card can definitely come back now and not do a lot. Next is a card that could be a little bit more controversial, and that's actually MAJESPECTER Unicorn KIRIN. This card is a part of the MAJESPECTER archetype, especially which have a shared flavor effect that says this card cannot be targeted or destroyed by your opponent's card effects. And then the most important effect is actually during either player's turn, you can target one pendulum monster in your monster zone and one monster your opponent controls, return them to the hand. So this is a quick effect that allows you to effectively bounce a scaled pendulum monster in your monster zone and also a monster in your opponent's zone. You can also bounce itself as well. And I was a little shocked to see that this card was not actually released after we got some new recent MAJESPECTER support in the recent booster pack. MAJESPECTER Orthros Nui is a link 2 that's very, very powerful. We also got some more MAJESPECTER stuffs in terms of spell cards and a little porcupine that's also very, very handy dandy. There are a lot of new cards in the MAJESPECTER type. And you know, I was expecting this deck to be somewhat playable, especially if KIRIN came back, but surprisingly, Konami actually left this card banned. I know this card is very, very powerful in pendulum-based strategies. In MAJESPECTER going first, it'd be a very, very annoying card to get rid of. You cannot target it with things like infinite impermanence, and you cannot destroy it with things like Raigeki or any board break removal like Lightning Storm or any card that would try and remove it. So it's very, very sticky, and they're basically guaranteed to get it off. You're not going to be able to negate it or anything, but I still think, you know, the power creep nowadays has said that any Yu-Gi-Oh deck can effectively go first and generate a huge board. It doesn't really matter what deck you're playing. If you're going first, you're going to make like a basically unbreakable board. It's more going second that's the issue, and I'm not convinced that KIRIN actually allows the deck to go second that well. Like the pendulum decks in its entirety, you have to play a lot of engine cards. Generally, you just don't have a good time going second. Most of the times, the pendulum combos involve at least 2 or more cards to actually make their full combo, and that just makes it very, very difficult for a deck nowadays to be able to go second with just 2 cards instead of just a 1-card starter or something like a Snake Eye Ash, right? So that's why I think there could be debate for this card to actually come back from the ban list, but I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts because I think it's something Konami might be crazy enough to do to put back to 1, and I don't think it's that broken enough. Next is another card, SPYRAL Master Plan. This is kind of in the same vein of KIRIN in the fact that obviously it's very, very powerful in spirals. This card was banned because spirals could loop a bunch of stuff, and when Master Plan is sent to the graveyard, you're allowed to actually add a copy of the Spiral Trap card. So typically they would add something like a Spiral Mission Rescue as well as a copy of the field spell, which allows you to further off go into your combos and then dump the trap card in the graveyard, the rescue, so you could banish it and bring back more spirals and keep looping. But this card is already freed in the OCG, and they have Max C, and basically the deck is not that good. It tops as a rogue deck. It's a very, very low, probably like tier 2 or tier 3 deck. Sometimes it gets some tops, but generally in the OCG it's not doing very well. I know they have Max C, so it's a little different, but I feel like in the TCG nowadays, again, decks can go first. You know, spirals can easily go first. Going second might be a bit more of a problem, so I'm not entirely convinced that Master Plan actually changes anything. If the decks are already powerful enough going first and can spawn a bunch of monsters on the board and leave you with 5 or 6 cards in hand like Fire King and Snake Eyes can, then why can't Spiral just do that themselves, right? They're a little clunky. They're definitely not like a 1-card full combo anymore. So I think this deck is a little bit power crept, and Master Plan could probably come back to 1. Next is the last of the Dragon Rulers, TIDAL, Dragon Ruler of Waterfalls. If you guys have been following the game in the previous ban list, you'll know that we actually got back basically all the other Dragon Rulers, including Blaster, Tempest, which was one of the first ones to be freed, as well as Redox, which is the most recent one to be freed, I believe. And these cards have done absolutely nothing. The cards have been power crept in its entirety. Yes, it was a broken deck 11 years ago, before we had Link mechanics or Pendulum mechanics or whatever the heck power crept has left us to. But nowadays, they just don't do anything, and I would love to see TIDAL come back because this card is especially good in decks that are water-based because you can bring it back as a level 7 extender. So back in the day, we would always use this in the Mermail deck with something like a Abyss Megalo, so you can easily overlay into something like an Abyss Giles, and it was just very, very handy-dandy, the fact that you can just keep bringing it back over and over. Not to mention that he's a water, so you can discard him. Using something like a Gold Sarcophagus, you can also banish him to add powerful water dragon monsters like Dragon Ice. This is just a strategy that was playable way back in the day. Nowadays, I just don't think it's good, and if we are actually getting the new Atlantean structure decks, the coincidental timing would mean that Konami can bring back TIDAL, and we just have another toy to play with the Atlanteans, and I just don't think that it's anywhere near busted in the modern metagame. It could definitely come back and, you know, just let us play with our dragons again and have some fun. Next is The spell cards. Okay, so Butterfly Dagger Elma. I don't know why this card has been on the ban list forever. Back in the day, it was originally banned because of the fact that it could be heavily abused with Gearfried the Iron Knight. So this card says if either player equips an equipped spell card to this card, destroy that card immediately. And what you would effectively do with Elma is that Elma says when this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard while equipped, you can return it to your hand. So you could do a bunch of loops by continuously recycling Elma back over and over into your hand alongside the Gearfried. And then you could also play other cards in tandem with this loop, like Spell Absorption, a continuous spell card that says each time a spell is activated, gain 500 life points immediately after it resolves, meaning you could gain infinite life points. So how it works in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is if there is an infinite loop, you can just declare that you want to do it infinite times. So you would activate Spell Absorption, equip Elma to the Gearfried, it gets destroyed, you gain 500 life points, recycle back Elma back to your hand, activate it again, gain 500, it gets destroyed, rinse and repeat. This could also be paired with something like a Fire Princess who says each time you gain life points, inflict 500 damage to your opponent's life points directly, so you could just OTK them. Yes, these strategies are very, very outdated. We're talking like early 2003, 2004 when it was actually viable, and this card has been banned ever since. Yeah, guys, like this card does absolutely nothing. I have a super rare. I would love to just chuck it in my collection binder if it was playable, so hopefully this does come back. Konami's completely forgotten about it. It would do absolutely zero things in the current metagame, and yeah, it'd be cool to have it back. Next is a bit of a more controversial card, but Metamorphosis. I actually think this card could come back feasibly. It's not a card that's typically searchable unless you pair it with something like Triple Tactics Thrust, but it still requires a hefty investment. If you guys play GOAT format, you'll actually know what this card does. It says tribute a monster, special summon a fusion monster from your extra deck with the same level as a tributed monster. So for example, back in the day, you would tribute something like a Cyber Dragon to summon out something like a Dark Balter the Terrible, which back in the day, fusion monsters did have some decent effects, and they were very, very hard to get out. So if you could cheat out a fusion monster, you were generally in a good spot. There are also cards like Thousand Eyes Restrict that you could use scapegoat tokens to summon out back in the GOAT format. And nowadays, there are just, obviously, there are some pretty broken monsters out there. We have like Naturia Exterio, which is pretty easily made with a level 10 monster. We also have all the runic monsters that you can easily special summon and cheat out of your extra deck. Then from there, just sacrifice them to summon out an equivalent fusion monster. But from what I've seen, I just don't think that Metamorphosis is that busted. I mean, this card, I can't think of any feasible, consistent FTK or OTK or crazy end board, because you would have to hard draw this card, you would have to sacrifice a monster, make sure everything goes right. If this card gets stopped somehow by an Omni Negate, you're losing 2 cards. And we've actually seen a recent release of a retrained version of Metamorphosis called Metamorphosis, which says tribute a fusion or synchro monster, then special summon a monster from your deck with the same level as a tributed monster's original level, but return it to the hand during the end phase. And this card has not been that great. Now, I know there's obviously a stark contrast between the main deck and the extra deck, but I mean, a card similar to Metamorphosis, allowing you to tutor out any monster that's equivalent to these stats or these types of monsters, fusion or synchro in the case of Metamorphosis, has not yet led this card to be broken or abused in any way, shape, or form, predominantly because it's just not searchable. It's a non-engine card that you would rather just play defensive cards like Triple Tactics Talent or maybe hand traps instead in that slot. And if you're generally winning nowadays in Yu-Gi-Oh! If you're playing, you're probably winning because the engines are just so powerful that you don't require non-engine cards that don't actually stop or interact with your opponent, like Metamorphosis. So I could definitely see this card come back as a wild card. I would love to hear what you guys think about this. Up next is another spell card, but a continuous spell card that was banned for a good reason. KAISER COLOSSEUM. This card says if there is one or more monsters on the field of the controller of this card, their opponent cannot place a monster on the field that would basically exceed the number of monsters that the controller of KAISER COLOSSEUM controls. So this is really, really devastating when combined with control-based strategies. Back in the day, we had a deck called Bujins, which was a very, very heavy-handed control deck. You would summon out Bushin Yamato, activate KAISER COLOSSEUM, and your opponent effectively could not summon more than one monster while you controlled one. So this is a very, very powerful alternative almost to summon limit that it restricts you from summoning monsters as long as your opponent controls one. Why do I think KAISER COLOSSEUM might come back to one? Yes, I know this card was broken. It was banned for good reason because it was a powerful floodgate, but we're actually getting some new support of dragons called the Tenpai Dragons, and these guys are a battle face oriented deck that can deal up to 35,000 damage off of just one lone dragon itself, allowing you to go off into existing strategy like Trident Dragon, which can attack up to 3 times for 9,000 additional damage. And it turns out this deck actually likes going second because it's an OTK style deck that revolves around the battle phase. Well, players playing against this deck, obviously, if they lose game 1 or game 2, they will actually allow their opponent to go first, which is where KAISER Colosseum has been a extremely powerful godsend of a card that Tenpai Dragon players are actually taking advantage of, knowing that their opponent's going to allow them to go first so they can activate KAISER Colosseum, meaning their opponent cannot play. So I think Konami, realizing this in the OCG, might say, hey, you know what? We're going to give the TCG cards a wild card and allow them to actually boost the power level of the Tenpai Dragons to sell, you know, make more sales, sell the cards, and then, you know, if they have to go first, they can activate their lone copy of KAISER Colosseum. At one copy, it might not do enough for the format, but of course, this could trigger a seismic shock in the actual demographic of Yu-Gi-Oh players saying, wow, this floodgate is coming back. Hey, you know, this could be possible, right? So yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think? Moving on to the traps. Last turn. This is a very confusing card that says this card can only be activated during your opponent's turn when your life points are 1,000 or less. Select one monster on your side of the field and send all other cards on the field and in the respective owner's hands to the graveyard. So effectively, you just keep your monster. That's it. After that, your opponent selects and special summons one monster from their deck in face-up attack mode and attacks your selected monster. The player whose monster remains alone on the field at the end of the turn wins the duel, otherwise it results in a draw. So this was originally banned back in the day because you could easily abuse it with a card like Jowgen the Spiritualist by summoning out Jowgen to the board and flipping last turn. It meant that Jowgen's effect applies, which says your opponent cannot special summon monsters, and neither can you. So that means that your opponent would not be able to actually be special summoning a monster from their deck to fulfill the last condition of last turn, meaning you're always the one with one monster on the board at the end of the resolution, and you automatically win the duel. So there were decks that were kind of built just to do that, but nowadays a trap card is just not going to do anything, unless you can literally set it off a Triple Tactics Thrust, which again requires a lot of setup and requirements. I just don't see this trap card being anywhere near metagame or anywhere near abused, and I think Konami again just forgot about this card, and they could definitely bring it back. And this card is really nice. It comes in ultra rare back in the day, so I would love to kind of take this out on a troll mission if it does come unbanned.
Really quickly, if you guys aren't already subscribed to the channel, definitely consider hitting that subscribe button at the bottom. It'll go a long way to support the channel. Other than that, thanks a lot for tuning in.
Next is another trap. Return from the different dimension. This one's a little more controversial because back in the day, there were a lot of powerful decks that could actually abuse it. You could abuse it with things like the dragons, the Darkham Dragon, banishing a bunch of darks and then resurrecting them for an OTK. You could also do it in Bayu Turbo back in the day, all the dark monsters, the Blackwings that are coming back. And of course, the iconic Dragon Rulers. You would just banish all your Dragon Rulers and play return, summon back everything, and go for a game shot. But nowadays, you know, traps are just way too slow if they're not interacting with your opponent. And this card is just not required at all. It says pay half your life points, special summon as many of your banished monsters as possible, but I mean by then, a turn late, this card is not going to do anything in the current metagame, and I just don't think that it's going to be abused, so I think it can come back. Now let's move to the last section, the extra deck monsters, starting with the top. ZOODIAC DRIDENT. This is one of my favorite cards of all time. I just love Zodiacs. If you guys have played Zodiacs around 2017, then you'll remember how busted these guys were. They're basically one XYZ monster that you can place on top of any Zodiac monster. So yes, the XYZ mechanic traditionally revolves around having 2 of the same level monster. For example, in the case of Drident, you actually require 4 level 4 monsters to overlay on top of each other to summon out a Drident. But in the case of the Zodiacs, they cheated this mechanic by allowing to place the XYZ onto any Zoodiac monster without having to require other monster bodies. So I can go ahead and normal summon a Zoodiac Thoroughblade and then instantly overlay for a Zoodiac Tiger Mortar, instantly overlay another Zoodiac on top of that, so on and so forth until you use all of the 13 Zoodiacs and end off with something powerful like a Drident who allows you to detach a card from himself as a quick effect and pop a face-up card on the field. This was originally brought back during the Tri-Brigade era when Tri-Brigade Zoodiac decks were heavily abused, and we also had Zodiac Barrage as well, which was unbanned alongside Drident and was quickly later banned when Konami realized Zodiac Barrage and Drident are a little too busted, especially when you combine them also with Divine Arsenal AA Zeus, and pure Zodiac decks were actually flourishing for some time because you could play a bunch of hand traps in that deck and just have one monster being summoned and then attack your opponent with something like a Drident and overlay for a Zeus. And having the existence of Drident meant that deck could easily go first, but banning Drident meant that it could no longer go first because you had nothing to end banned on that it was a disruption, and instead the deck would go second and eventually peter out of existence because it was power crept. But now, by today's standards, I don't feel like this card is very powerful at all. In Master Duel, we actually have it back to 3, I believe, and it doesn't really do anything. So I would love to see this card come back just so players can kind of mess around with the pure ZOODIAC engine, even though it's not as splashable, because we are still going to keep Barrage banned, in my opinion. We just do not want to give any decks extraneous extenders. We'll just give them a Trident to play around with, and that's probably enough. Next is another card that was banned, SABER INVOKER. This card is not really an X-Saber. You could call it ZOODIAC INVOKER because it was actually used back in the day in 60-card Lightsworn / Grass is Greener decks to summon out ZOODIAC Rapier. Yep, this card requires 2 level 3 monsters, and he says once per turn you can detach a material from this card, special summon 1 level 4 Earth Warrior or Beast Warrior from your deck in defense position, but destroy it during the end phase, which doesn't really matter for the destruction in the end phase because we're summoning out a Rapier and we're instantly going off into our full Zoo combo. Of course, it was very easy to make the SABER INVOKER because you would just use something like the Predaplant engine, Predaplant Orphis Scorpio. Back in the day, you'd use his discard something to summon out the corresponding Predaplant Darnatolia Cobra, who would then allow you to search a Brilliant Fusion, and then from there, you not only had Brilliant Fusion, but you also had SABER INVOKER to summon out either Rapier or another Beast-type Warrior, or Thousand Blades Heroic Champion, which is another card that was, I believe, played in tandem with Trick Clown in the same main, because you could summon this off of SABER INVOKER. Surprise, guys, but SABER INVOKER is actually back in the OCG, and it has been back for some time and has done absolutely nothing. Nowadays, this card is just not a toolbox card that you can easily splash into any deck, and I could definitely see it come back to the TCG and not do anything at all. And next is another fusion monster, or the first fusion monster rather, Thunder King Colossus, Thunder Dragon Colossus. This is a card that was originally banned because Thunder Dragons were just way too OP. He allows you to cheat himself out. He does require a Thunder Dragon plus a Thunder monster normally, but you can actually use the rest of his effect by fulfilling the condition where you actually activate the effect of a Thunder monster in your hand. You can actually tribute a Thunder effect non-fusion monster from your field to summon him out instead of actually requiring the monsters plus polymerization to fuse into him. And he has a hardcore floodgate effect that says cards cannot be added from the main deck to your opponent's hand except by drawing them, and can also protect himself by being destroyed by battle or card effect by banishing a Thunder monster from your graveyard instead. So a lot of people would splash the Thunder Dragon engine and allow you to play the generic Thunder Dragon extenders and then end off with the Thunder Dragon monster on the field and tribute that off to summon out the Colossus, thereby locking out your opponent from playing as a final game end piece that was really reminiscent of the old days where Thunder King Ryo did pretty much the same thing on legs, but now you could actually tutor this out directly from your extra deck. But nowadays, I just don't think this is that powerful. And spoiler, again, this card has been freed in the OCG for some time at 1 copy. And, you know, some people have marginally played Thunder Dragons, but it has not been that oppressive. I think bringing it back to 1 makes some sense, because back in the day, you would put up 3 Thunder Dragon Colossus on an end board, and that was hard to deal with. But just 1 should be okay. You know, we have a lot of cards to instantly nullify it. We have cards like Infinite Impermanence, of course, and Book of Moon, stuff like that just allows you to turn it off. So I would love to appease the hunger of Thunder Dragon Duelists and actually bring this card back. I think Konami would be crazy enough to do it because it's back in the OCG. The last 2 cards are a little bit controversial, but guys, let me know what you think. Starting with HEAVYMETALFOES ELECTRUMITE. Actually, Konami would be crazy enough to bring this back. This is at 1 in the actual OCG. It's freed, but it's been banned in the TCG because back in the day, pendulums were a little bit too busted. We had a lot of broken pendulum monsters that were a little bit too pushed, and the deck could put up huge end boards that had multiple negates. You know, there were a bunch of stuff like the Pepe monsters, and back in the day, the power creep was not to the point where you could actually play through any of this, and there were not as many hand traps that were versatile against this type of strategy. So HEAVYMETALFOES ELECTRUMITE was quickly banned. This, of course, requires 2 pendulum monsters that says if it's link summoned, you can place a pendulum monster from your deck to your extra deck face up, so it allows you to search for any pendulum monster, puts it in your extra deck face up, and then it has the effect where once per turn you can target it, another face up card you control, destroy it, then add a face up pendulum monster from your extra deck to your hand. So effectively you could place anything, destroy something, and then add back whatever you place, so you search that card to your hand. And then it has another effect that says if a card in your pendulum zone leaves the field, draw a card. So you would pop one of your pendulum scales, add back the card that you searched, and then you would be able to draw a card. And typically this was very, very deadly when combined with Astrograph Sorcerer, which is a card that says if a card you control is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can special summon this card from your hand, then choose 1 monster in the graveyard, extra deck, or that's banished and was destroyed this turn, then add 1 monster with the same name from your deck to your hand. So you would obviously place Astrograph Sorcerer in your extra deck from your deck. Use the effect of Electrumite to destroy one of your face-up pendulum scales, add back Sorcerer, then in a new chain, Electrumite allows you to draw a card, and Sorcerer allows you to special summon itself because it saw the destruction of the pendulum scale, and then you can add back another copy of the pendulum scale, so you effectively just did a crazy thing that allowed you to add, I guess, 3 cards to your hand. You drew a card, you added back the card you destroyed, and then you also added the Astrograph Sorcerer, which is now on your field as an extender. Now, I think pendulums have been suffering for a long time, and the strategy is obviously only good going first. This deck plays a lot of engine cards, and there's just not enough room for non-engine. It really struggles going second because you have to play multiple pendulum cards in order to stand any chance and actually put up a board. And nowadays, everything just has 1-card starters, so it's just been power crept. I think decks can already do crazy stuff going first. It doesn't really matter if we get a crazy pendulum deck. It's more so the fact that it's not consistent enough to go second. So I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on that, but I think Konami could be crazy enough to do it eventually. And last but not least, this is a card that I've been thinking about that Konami might just be crazy enough to bring this back, but TIARLAMENTS KITKALLOS. Yes, I know TIARLAMENTS are absolutely busted, but the cards have been all restricted to 1. This card was obviously banned originally in the first wave of TIARLAMENTS because these cards were way too powerful. It's a milling strategy that allows you to fusion summon when you mill these guys, and then you just go off to the races with a bunch of free advantage from your deck directly, and you, depending on your mills, you could actually win the duel on the spot. Now, this was obviously very, very busted with the actual retrains of the Ishizu cards. So Yugioh allowing you to mill 5 cards when he's sent from your deck to the graveyard, as well as milling your opponent, and Kalbeck, which does the exact same thing. So you can mill up to 10 cards plus the TIARLAMENTS. You can actually mill up to like 35 cards at one point when the deck was tier 0, and they banned TIARLAMENTS KITKALLOS for good reason, and recently Kalbeck and Yugioh have both been banned, which leads me to think maybe we can actually get KITKALLOS back. The deck is not that powerful. We do have some new cards like the Horus cards, which are very, very powerful when combined with the TIARLAMENTS themselves, but I'm just not sure that the deck is that good. Even if we bring back the actual KITKALLOS now that power creep is a thing with the new Snake Eyes, and it seems like power creep is just going upwards, whoop, and TIARLAMENTS have been kind of power crept out of the metagame. We also have preventative measures like the Bystials in the game that can kind of deal with them, worst comes to worst. So I think, you know, maybe we could actually toy around with the idea of bringing back TIARLAMENTS KITKALLOS. This card allows you to add a TIARLAMENTS card from your deck when you special summon, and then when he's sent to the graveyard by card effect, you can mill 5 cards. Yes, that actually does seem kind of broken. Plus the other effect, you can actually target a monster you control, special summon a TIARLAMENTS monster from your hand or grave, and if you do, send the targeted monster to the graveyard. So you can obviously do this with Merly and then mill up to 8 cards, which is kind of devastating that I think about it. But I mean, is this that broken nowadays in the format? Again, the deck might struggle a little bit going second because you do not have a lot of room for non-engine. But I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on the KITKALLOS and every card that we've gone over here so far. I kind of inspected the ban list and said, you know what? These cards are not that broken. There's a chance that Konami might actually break the mold and bring these guys back. So if you guys are looking for a small-time investment to stock up on, maybe these cards could be a good idea, or otherwise it could just be pure speculation. You know, create like a binder that you can trade for these cards and pick them up at locals, and then see what happens to be unbanned. Guys, if you like this, let me know below what other cards you think can be unbanned, and if any of these cards you think are way too broken.